my paradigm differs from that in two respects. One, that markets don't reflect the underlying reality correctly. They always distort or have a bias built into them. That's permanent because of this inability to base decisions in knowledge, particularly when it comes to the future. And the second thing is that occasionally, not always, but there are ways in which that biased view of reality expressed in market prices can actually affect the fundamentals that market prices are supposed to reflect. So this affect and reflect, that's this reflexive connection that comes into play, but it doesn't necessarily have to be at play. So normally markets actually correct their mistakes, but occasionally those misconceptions find a way to reinforce the underlying reality that they reflect and reinforce the misconception itself. So that's how you get these self-reinforcing, initially self-reinforcing, but eventually self-defeating. So that's the reflexivity as it applies to financial markets. Then you have the particular phenomena of bubbles, boom-bust sequences. Now the important thing to recognize that they don't occur all the time. Nevertheless, financial markets are prone to produce boom-bust sequences. And that is where, of course, the theory of equilibrium goes out of the window. It doesn't happen all the time, but it happens quite often. And it's always connected with credit, the extension of credit. And therefore, this boom-bust process has an asymmetric shape. Because during the boom phase, the value of the collateral against which you can borrow increases. Therefore, you can borrow more. And the willingness to lend and the willingness to borrow also increases. And that's a slow process that builds up over a period of time. But when you reach the reversal point where prices fall, the value of the collateral falls, and credit is at its maximum extension by definition, because you are in a reversal. And then you have a contraction of credit reinforced by forced sales, because margin calls or forced liquidation of leverage. That's what you are experiencing right now in the markets. And that's short and sharp. So you have this asymmetric shape. And that's the theory of boom-bust, but it's not the only reflexive phenomenon. But it's very important because it does lead to financial crises. Crises do a lot of damage, and therefore there's a need for regulation. And as the financial markets develop, regulation developed. And each time you had a crisis, you had some change in the regulatory environment. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, that the regulators are subject to the same human conditions as the market participants. So they also act on imperfect understanding and imperfect knowledge. And so you have this interplay between regulators and the market. And that actually has become an ongoing process. It happens also when you're not in crisis. You know, the central bank controls the money supply, and it raises interest rates, lowers interest rates, trying to get it right. And the market tries to guess what the central bank is going to do, and so you have a cat and mouse game going on. And that cat and mouse game is a reflexive phenomenon, and that is there all the time. And also, actually, when you look at exchange rates, they are also reflexive. There is no equilibrium in exchange rates. But there isn't this asymmetry between up and down. They tend to, freely fluctuating exchange rates tend to move in waves, and there's no difference between up and down. But those are also reflexive phenomena which are there all the time. Now I come to the current crisis. And here I propose a specific hypothesis as to the nature of this crisis, which may or may not be valid and doesn't actually necessarily invalidate the other parts of the theory. And this is not a simple bubble. It's actually composed of two bubbles. There is a simple bubble in real estate, particularly in US housing and particularly in subprime loans, which acted as the detonator of a much bigger bubble that has been growing much longer. And that super bubble, that's the interesting one. And it's more complicated than the simple bubble, because real estate bubbles are the simplest form of bubbles. They keep on recurring. It always has to do with an extension of credit, greater willingness to lend, and a false conception that the willingness to lend doesn't influence the value of the collateral, that somehow the collateral, the value of the collateral is independent of the willingness to lend. That's a misconception, keeps on recurring, and is at the core of real estate bubbles. That's simple. But now the super bubble is a much more complicated phenomenon.